Hello everybody. This game that I'm about to show you is a master game again from 1909. It is Marshall against Capablanca, and for this video I want to focus on computer analysis and when it is very useful and when computers can sometimes get things wrong. I won't say any more right now because I don't want to bias you later when I'm explaining about the computer analysis. Uh, anyway, to start off, Marshall was white and played e4. e6 was then played, d4, d5. So we now have the French defence, which is very, very popular at all levels of chess, really. And there are quite a lot of options that white and black both have from this position after move 2. White chose knight c3, and black can play pawn takes, bishop b4, sometimes even c5 is a not seen much, but it's interesting. But in this game, the classical French was played knight f6. And again, white has options, but chose bishop g5, bishop e7 was played, and then white advanced the pawn to e5, gaining space. And Capablanca, instead of retreating the knight to d7, played knight e4, knight takes knight was played, bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes. So here, the computer gives this as roughly even, which I would agree to. It's difficult to see any particular big advantage for either side. Again, white's d4 pawn can be pressurized in the game with sort of knight c6, pawn c5, maybe the queen going somewhere to attack the d4 pawn. Whereas white has a e5 pawn and a space advantage, so it's easier to maneuver his pieces. So to continue, g3 was played, c5, thematic move, then c3 just to allow a recapture with the pawn if black takes on d4, knight c6, and now f4. So white is chucking the pawns up quite quickly and has this massive pawn triangle going all the way from b2 to e5 to h2. So it appears to be a very strong pawn chain, pawn formation, but it's rather fixed in nature at the moment. So maybe black could perhaps pressurize certain squares, not only d4, but usually the base of the pawn chain. So b2 and h2 could be attacked and made the sort of focus point for black's pieces. Anyway, black retreated the queen to e7, white develops, bishop d7 was played, queen d2 was now played, just controlling more dark squares with the queen, castles, and here, after bishop d3, we have the first point of perhaps disagreement, perhaps total agreement with the computer analysis here. It gives the position as roughly even. The longer you leave it on, the sort of more the evaluation is made more accurate by the computer thinking for longer. But generally, it gives a evaluation of 0, or very, very tiny amounts over exactly nil. So for those of you who don't know, if the computer analysis is 0, that means even, and if it's a positive number, that means white is the one with the advantage, and if it's a negative number, black will have the advantage. And if it's -1, that would be -1 point, so a pawn. -3 might be a minor piece, -5 a rook, and so on. So yes, here it gives the best move, or one of the best moves, as c4, which was played in the game, gaining a tempo on the bishop. And the idea is that after white retreats the bishop, black will play b5 and try and attack on the queen side, which is where you're taught to attack based on the formation of your pawns. So black's pawns, the pawn chain starts at f7, continues on to e6, d5, and c4. So it's from the start point to the end point, it's sort of pointing at the queen side like an arrow. And white, usually in the French, will attack on the king's side. So his pawn chain starts at b2, c3, d4, e5, and if you continue along that line, it will head over to the king's side. But if we just go back a couple of moves, I just want to know, what are your thoughts on this position with black to move? Would you play c4? Would you maybe move a rook? Maybe take on d4? Those are just some of the options. There are plenty more, of course. Yeah, I just want to have your thoughts on this, so maybe you could comment in the video on some of the computer analysis. If you want my opinion, for what it's worth, generally in the French, black wants to keep tension against d4. He wants to keep his options open as to whether he takes on d4 or not. So what the move I would probably play would be perhaps rook f to c8, possibly, or rook a to c8, because another thematic move in terms of creating tension is for black to play f6 at one point, and then have the option of taking on e5 as well. So I think my move would probably be rook a to c8 and see what's happening, because after c4 and bishop retreats and b5, as was played, the computer is thinking that here it's going to be a matter of which side can win on one side of the board first. So the computer is thinking black wants to quickly advance the pawns and win on the queen side, try and make the all the activity center around the queen side where he's better positioned. And c4 winning a tempo against the bishop was therefore a logical idea. And white will try and win on the king's side, but doesn't have as many pawns readily available to advance up the board. So that's the computer's way of thinking, but my way of thinking is that c4 releases the tension, so now white doesn't have to worry about captures on d4, and white's bishop is pointed straight at h7, which is often a thematic sacrifice. The knight can come to g5 quite quickly. White could castle either queenside, which wouldn't be very good because black's trying to attack over there, but white could castle kingside and then use the f file, or even move the king to h1 and put the rook onto the g file. White could even keep his king in the center, would say rook with king e2 and then rook a to g1 or rook a to f1. So I feel that white's pieces are better to have mobility and to be active. And generally in the French, white can have a devastating attack on the king's side. And again, because each side's trying to win on opposite sides of the board, you could say, okay, then there's even chances. But black's king is over on the king's side, so that's going to be a more urgent area to focus on. So black's queenside attack might grind to a halt because he's having to stop himself getting mated on the king's side. Anyway, enough of my talking. Let's see what happened. Castles. A5. So continuing with the idea. Rook A to E1. B4. And now black's already got 2 pawns in white's half of the board, and could perhaps cause some problems later on. But white here decides he's got 2 rooks in the centre, and just as a point of reference, in this sort of position, having your rook on the same line as the enemy queen does allow for potential tactics to occur. You might not be able to see them at this point. You might not be able to calculate that far ahead. I mean, I know I can't, but as it's there, it's just sort of hanging in the air. It's a potential eventuality that there could later be tactics based on it, and they usually are once the position is opened up. So white chose f5, throwing his pawns up and disrupting black's pawn structure. Black took, and now white decides to open it up more, g4. So white is using these rather immediate forcing moves, shall we say, to get his attack in first. It's quite difficult to just leave the pawn there and not really do much, so black is having to make moves on the king's side, increasing white's lead in the attack. Black actually took on g4, which the computer loves. Originally, when I first looked at the analysis, the computer was giving black a -2 advantage, so 2 pawns ahead, basically saying that white had no compensation for the lost pawns. After a while, though, it then started to give white a small a small compensation, but black still was ahead by 1.5, so 2 pawns ahead, and white had half a pawn in compensation. And after knight g5, the computer gave as the best move h6. Just to explore the computer line before going on to the game continuation, I played as white for the next few moves, and I gave the computer a few minutes to think on its move. And the computer is rated probably about 2800 or more, and I'm just some relative patzer on about 21 or 2200, depending on how you calculate from ECF or using my actual FIDE grade. So I played knight h7. Black plays 2 moves were given as almost equal. One was rook fe8 after about 30 seconds of analysis, and I played check. And here then the computer switched and gave me a really big advantage, because if black takes, then I can take with the rook, or even take on h6 with the queen, and I've got a horrible attack that looks like it's just going to crash through. And if black moves the king, I can just take the exchange. So the second move given after about 2 minutes, which I would guess is the more accurate move, is bishop e6, and then after knight takes and rook takes, I looked at the analysis and left it for about 2 minutes, and it gave a very small advantage to black, but I'm not sure I believe that, to be honest. I feel that the exchange might be quite telling, the more the game opens up in the future. It's just that there's a thing called the horizon effect, where a computer is a raw calculating machine. It's very tactical, and it can look at the positional features of a position, but it's not currently able to look very long term and see how the position will metamorphose over the next 10 or 20 moves. So currently it sees that his knight is probably as good as a rook, so, or maybe a tiny bit worse, but still pretty good. And black is still has more pawns, so it therefore gives black the small advantage. But eventually, when we swap off more things, white's rook may be able to run around and take a couple of pawns or threaten lots of things. And the more exchanges happen, and the more exchanges of pawns happen, the more likely this is to occur. So here I would say the position was fairly even, actually. Anyway, that was not the game continuation. In the game, Capablanca played g6. And here, not to harp on about it too much, but I feel like it's very relevant. What has g6 has achieved something in that the h7 pawn was under attack, and now g6 has stopped the bishop attacking h7. But what does g6 do, which doesn't really help black's control of the king side? Well, as many of you might have seen in games, black plays g6 to fianchetto usually, with a bishop on g7. And the reason for this is that the bishop on g7 is controlling all the dark squares around the king, and the pawns are controlling all the light squares. So as we're missing the bishop here, the dark squares are being neglected. So white takes advantage of this by playing rook f6, a square given by the last move, g7 to g6. Black now does play a move different to what the computer says. The computer gives takes and white recaptures. So the computer evaluation here was interesting because over time it slowly started to give white a bigger and bigger lead. Originally it gave black as -2, and then it kept on increasing until white actually had a small plus here. Because after the pawn exchanges, where a little bit was happening on the queen side, black now apparently has to defend with this. According to the computer, knight d8 is the best move. And very simply, white can just build with his pieces, attacking the weak f7 pawn that's being blockaded. So in this position, h6 would be played by the computer, trying to drive white's knight to capture on f7 and sacrifice, which wouldn't be very sound, but instead, queen h4 takes, queen takes. So if we pause here, black is ahead in material by a pawn and a knight, so +4 on the computer evaluation, but here white has so much compensation that actually this position was seen as dead even by the computer after a few minutes analysis. But I would generally say that the computer underestimates the side with the attack usually, because it's very again very logical, and it's not designed to be speculative. So it will always try and go with the more solid, correct, logical move. And so generally, some engines are a little different, but the one I'm using generally underestimates the attack because it doesn't see it as being correct. It can find defensive resources very quickly, but uh, positional advantages accrued by the attack don't seem to be taken into consideration for quite a while. So here, bishop e8 was seen to be okay for black, but then bishop takes g6, sacking some more material. F takes pretty much has to be played, otherwise discovered checks will simply win for white. Rook takes, king g7, rook back to f6, rook b7 taking control of the b file, queen takes g4. So here the position's changed a little bit, so that white is a pawn up for a pawn and a rook for a bishop and knight, which is even in terms of just material. Perhaps some people calculate a rook as being 4.5 points, so black would be half a pawn up. But after a while, the analysis gave white as having almost a pawn's advantage. It was 0.9, which is usually seen as enough to win. I've heard some players say that if the computer gives one side as more than half a pawn up, so more than 0.5, it should be enough to win the game or have very good chances of winning. So at this point, I stopped analysing because I thought we'd just be going on and on down the rabbit hole if I kept on playing out moves. But just to show, this is how the position could metamorphose, and the rooks here are very, very powerful indeed. So going back, in the game, black plays king g7, and I think the idea here was to play h6 next move, but Marshall doubles rooks on the f-file, so he's playing very natural moves. He's not doing anything splendid just yet. He's just playing the natural continuation that just builds on the attack. So white now has 3 pieces on f7. Black does have 3, but he'll have to lose his queen in holding the f7 square. So bishop e8 was played. Queen f4, okay, 4 pieces on the attack. Knight d8. So overprotecting f7 a little bit, but I think also trying to reroute the knight to e6 at some stage. And before I go on, the computer does give white better odds than previously, so it gives black being half a pawn up in to the good, so minus 0.5 approximately. But have a look at black's position. Again, the thing computers don't do is that as they're not like us, they don't really have a psychological angle to them, which I would argue over the board can be a massive factor, a big deciding factor, sometimes more important than time or material or almost any other single factor. And here, look at black's pieces. Arguably, the queen is the only piece that's really doing anything. The knight and bishop, okay, they're protecting f7, but having pieces on the back rank is not exactly having mobile, active pieces. They're both not able to move, unless you want to allow f7 to be attacked more and perhaps taken immediately. The rook on f8 again is tied to f7. The rook on a8, I can't really see what it's doing. And the king is having to actually play a defensive role at this point. So a slightly stressed out king at this point. Whereas white has tripled on the f-file with his queen and 2 rooks. He's got a bishop pointing at those pawns on g6 and h7, so there are possible sacrifices in the air. The knight is also influencing and targeting pawns and squares around black's king. Uh, so just from a psychological point of view, disregarding the computer evaluation for a moment, I mean, disagree with me if you like, but I would prefer to have white here all day long. I mean, it's so much easier to play as white. You've got a clear plan, attack, target squares, mobilize your pieces. The pieces are pulling their weight. There's certainly a lot of speculative sacrifices and moves here. You don't have anything to really worry about. You've already sacrificed a couple of pawns, but there aren't really any weaknesses that you have to speak of. And if you were black, you would be desperately clinging on and hoping that white's attack would just peter out and you would be able to either swap off or repel white's forces. But again, not a position I would like. And it's quite easy here to crack under the pressure. So Capablanca was probably quite distressed by white's next move of e6, adding another attacker to f7. And again, black is having a hard time here because f takes e6 would just lose a rook. Knight takes e6 would just lose a rook again to knight takes e6 and then check. And then if black doesn't capture, white could just take the rook with the knight. And if black does capture, again, the rook on f8 is hanging. So now this pawn is being attacked yet again. So rook a6 was now played, attempting to pin the pawn so that after e takes f7, rook takes f6. But even that might not be sufficient because white could just play pawn takes bishop and could cheekily promote to a knight with check and cause more problems. So this position is just becoming absolutely horrible for black. I haven't really analysed this fully, but if I quickly turn on a engine here, because what engines can do, positionally engines have a hard time calculating positional moves, but tactically they're absolute monsters. So here actually it does. Okay, no, here apparently I was wrong. Black can survive all this. So rook a6 was not a bad move, but it does. Let's turn this computer off now. It does sort of what's the word? Yeah, the rook a6. It does put some pressure on white, but there are still lots of resources white has because e6 freed up e5 for the queen. So now there is a discovered check looming and hovering above black's head. So here, king h6 was played, and now the computer, in the last move or so, did give white as having a huge advantage. So when it has to calculate tactics, the computer does do a fine job, far better than any human. But again, as I reiterate, positionally it's lacking. So here it can find the move that Marshall did play, and the best move in the position by far, and one I must confess I probably would not have seen in the game. But who knows? If I had enough time to think, maybe a few hours, I might have found it. Can anyone see the crushing move that Marshall played in this position? Well, if any of you found it, well done. Rook 1 to f5. So if we gave black a move like some just passing move like a4, white could win rather quickly with knight takes f7 check, and if black captures with, let's say, the knight, check, mate. It's very, very nice. And the other move would be here, and then there's another lovely mate with double discovered check, double discovered checkmate. So using all of white's pieces to deliver mate, which I really, really like. Even the pawn on e6 is working its magic here. So that's the threat. So whenever you're defending, or in any other position really, with in a game, always think, what is my opponent threatening to do? What's their immediate plan of action? So in this game, Capablanca did see that, so he played f takes e6, and after knight takes f7 check, there's a similar idea if king g7 was played. Rook takes g6, double check, king takes, and then rook g5. Oh no, sorry, not rook g5. Rook rook f6 check, king. Oh, I'll show you on the board actually. If here check, you can either play rook f6 and then rook to g6, or rook here takes mate. So black actually played queen takes, and what would you play as white in this position? Yeah, hopefully you've seen this doesn't really prevent the original threat, to be honest. There was just basically nothing black could do. Rook h5 check, king g7, and now rook takes g6 mate. So very, very strong attack there, and conducted fantastically well by Marshall to checkmate Capablanca. And remember, this game was played in more than 100 years ago, 1909. So they didn't have computer analysis then, and this attack is, I think, just as good as any computer now. But those are the good points of the computer. Its tactics, its awareness of all the resources currently available to it. But just remember that when analysing with a computer, don't take some parts of it too sort of emphatically, because openings, the computer will often have an opinion of which one's best, but I mean, all openings that are sort of main line can be played, despite what the computer says, really, I think. So, for example, here it might give bishop b4 rather than knight f6 as better, but both are perfectly fine. They're both playable. And here it's sort of, again, it would give slightly different moves as being better, but again, both are playable. Here there's no advantage, which I agree with. There's not really a definitive advantage for either side here. There are potential advantages, such as white space advantage and black's slightly superior pawn structure, but we don't know how that's going to work itself out yet. The computer often suggests counterintuitive moves because, again, it's not like a human. After hundreds of times of playing a particular line, like the French defence or whatever other opening that you know of, you'll see similar themes. You might know that move X is always played, so you may as well play it because it will usually work itself out to be a good move. But the computer doesn't accumulate knowledge. It doesn't learn like a human does. So it will look at every single position. It will then reconsider all the options. So, for example, here it might not be for immediately. It might be for a very long time that black won't even consider c takes d4, which is a very common move in the French. Or in the next few moves, after black has castled, I actually left this on for a while, and it never even considered f6. And the reason for that is that the computer sees there's the pawn chain f7, e6, d5, and it thinks, okay, for a pawn chain, you don't really want to move the base of the pawn chain. You want to have all the pawns standing strong, defending each other. So f6 is counterintuitive and a positional mistake according to the computer, and there aren't any tactics to override it. But it's a thematic thing in the French, thematic idea in the French, and part of the reason for that is that you need to try and do a pawn break to nullify or counter white's space advantage. And when I actually input the move f6, it didn't love the move, but it then did start to give it as good an evaluation as the moves it had previously been suggesting. So again, positionally and for thematic ideas, beware. I would suggest opening books and talking to people would be better in terms of understanding more about openings and empirically playing them. Learn through experience. Don't just rely on computers, because I do feel that is being done a bit too much nowadays. Then again, just a personal gripe I have. So c4 is, again, the computer loves it. There are certainly some players who would play this, and I wouldn't say it's a bad move particularly. I wouldn't say it's a blunder or losing or anything like that, but it's just not in keeping with the spirit of the French defence. It's not a thematic move. It sort of disregards a lot of the play that black generally has, and part of the reason for that is that the follow-up idea of playing on the queen side is just too slow. I mean, f5, which will be played in a moment, f5 might have not be the most accurate move. Perhaps in this position, white could instead have played g4, for example, and then f5, or even h4 afterwards. But the idea, again, was to quickly break on the king side, which was not something the computer even glanced at. I don't think it never even had it in the top 5 moves. So this sort of idea of a pawn storm to open up the area of the board that you are strongest on, again, it just doesn't occur to them, to it rather, and that's proven by the fact that it rather dismissively gives white as losing by 2 pawns originally, and then eventually it's forced to change its mind. I'm talking about it like I'm personifying a machine here, but it does start to see tactical resources for white here, which do compensate for the 2 pawns. And it's after this position here, it then eventually does see that white's pieces are far more active. They've got lots of threats. There are loads of tactics, and black is walking a tightrope here, which a computer can do very well. A computer's very good at walking that tightrope and finding every defensive, tactical, and positional resource it has. But even here, it does give white as roughly even, or maybe even a small advantage. And yes, after this, white has then a big advantage, and the rest you saw. The computer is a brutal tactical monster, so then it saw that white is completely winning. Anyway, that will conclude my my gripe against the computers. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe. Any questions, put them below, and I'll see you in the next video.